Ночь темная, буря ракотанья. Слабый
Welcome to the fourth module in Doukhobors in Canada. In the third module, we learned about the support the Doukhobors received from Russian author Leo Tolstoy and others for their journey across the Atlantic Ocean and their first weeks in their new Canadian home. This module begins with the Doukhobors' initial experiences in Canada as they settled on the prairies.
In their first year, adjusting to life in Canada, the Doukhobors received invaluable assistance from the close associates of Leo Tolstoy. They acted as guides, mediators, and translators, and lived among the Doukhobors, providing tireless support. Leopold Sulorzytsky acted as a liaison and mediator between the Doukhobors and Canadian employment and business affairs. Dr. Velichkina and nurse Sasha Satz provided medical support throughout the villages, while Vladimir Bonch-Bruyevich documented Doukhobor beliefs and psalms in a text called the Životnaya Kniga, or the Living Book.
Winnipeg! Winnipeg! Shouted the train conductor. In each coach, Doukhobors peered out of the frozen windows, curious to see where they would be spending the winter. They disembarked and walked upon the frozen snow crackling under their feet towards a large 3-story immigration hall. This would be their home until winter passed and they could travel further to their prairie settlements. Even though the immigration hall was crowded, with bunk beds lining large common rooms, the Doukhobors soon fell into an orderly day-to-day routine. In silence, they shared simple meals such as oat soup, kasha, cabbage, potatoes, bread, tea, and milk, utilizing spoons they had carved out of wood.
No matter where they were, whether on a ship, train, or in immigration halls, the Doukhobors would gather to sing psalms. The first Sunday after their arrival in Winnipeg, they were able to hold their millennia as a full community. The immigration hall was spacious enough for the Doukhobors to stand in a traditional manner with men on one side and women on the other. One by one, women and men recited psalms, followed by group singing, as well as the reverential act of bowing deeply to each other. The gentle harmonic sounds of psalms would fill the room, drawing the gathered into a sense of spiritual unison. Their moral strength and unshakable tranquility would be reflected in their solemn faces, regardless of the suffering they endured. To the Doukhobors, time seemed to stand still.
Once winter passed, the Doukhobors journeyed by train as far as possible, then continued to their destinations in wagons and on foot, a lengthy and exhausting trek.
2 large land allotments in what is present-day Saskatchewan were reserved for the Doukhobors. Although the prairie lands appeared empty, unused, and available, they were in fact Indigenous lands colonized by the Canadian government. Indigenous people were forcibly removed from their territories and placed onto insufficient lands known as reserves. They faced such severe restrictions from the colonial-based Canadian government that their traditional lands, languages, cultures, and history underwent an orchestrated genocidal erasure. As a largely illiterate peasant people, Doukhobors would have likely been oblivious to the fact that they were given stolen lands. Yet, it did not slip past the awareness of Sulorzytsky. Within a short time in Canada, he recognized the injustices the Indigenous people faced. In his journal from 1899, he wrote that Indigenous peoples, former masters of the prairies, were facing a slow death. Quote, "The white man with his civilization is slowly but surely killing them," end quote. For their part, many Doukhobors that lived in close proximity to Indigenous people on the prairies did so in a harmonious manner, in some cases even cultivating supportive and caring friendships.
When the Doukhobors looked across the landscape that would become their home, they saw trees, rivers, and creeks. They saw beautiful meadows covered with wild prairie grasses and flowers. There was an abundance of wild strawberries, raspberries, gooseberries, currants, and plenty of mushrooms that would help diversify their simple diets. And even more important for them, the soil was ideal for farming.
To survive the first year, the Doukhobors worked in a communal manner and were largely self-sufficient. However, money was essential to develop even the simplest of homes and to acquire necessary resources and livestock. What they received from the government and other sources, such as the Quakers, was not enough to support thousands of Doukhobor newcomers. As a result, Doukhobor men had to leave their villages to find jobs, some on surrounding farms, with the majority finding work building railroads.
Prior to the Doukhobors arriving on the prairies, temporary communal houses were built for them in anticipation of them constructing their villages. Many of the able-bodied men went away to work on the railroads. Because of this, most of the labor involved in cultivating the land, falling timber, and building houses was left to the women and more elderly men. The women were more than capable to take on all the heaviest tasks required to farm and build, while also cooking, baking, and making all of their family's clothing, spinning and weaving wool and flax, and knitting socks and sweaters. They did all of this while keeping their homes and yards impeccably neat and clean. The children, for their part, would help in all the tasks, while infants would be taken care of by the elders. One day, while walking through a field, Sulorzycki movingly described what he saw.
When I came to a narrow strip of plowed field, I saw at the far end of it a colorful crowd of people slowly moving in my direction in a long row. These people were hitched in pairs to an iron plow. It became quite a sight when, stepping heavily on the wet grass, this somber procession began to approach me. There was something solemn, deeply moving in the figures of these straining women pulling the heavy plow. The heavy sticks to which the rope was tied cut into their bodies. With sunburnt hands, the women pushed the plow, trying to reduce the pain. Pair after pair of these women passed me with wary faces and eyes only looking ahead.
As Doukhobors, we often romanticize the image of women pulling the plow. Yet, cultivating new land and building homes was backbreaking work and crucial if they were going to plant their first crops. This really speaks to the strength and stamina of our great-great-great-grandmothers.
The first 2 shiploads of Doukhobors arrived on the prairies in the early spring of 1900. They had the opportunity to start building houses and cultivate the soil for farming well before the next winter. Homes were constructed out of logs, with the floors made from packed earth and the roofs covered with sod. Simple yet sturdy, these cabins were dry and warm.
It was a different scenario for the 2 shiploads of Doukhobors that arrived later. They reached the prairies without enough time to build durable houses before winter set in and ended up making earth-covered dugouts called ziemlinki. These were made by carving large dugouts into the hillside about 3 meters wide, 5 meters long, and 2 meters deep, then secured with heavy beams. The exposed roofs would be covered with soil. Unable to withstand freezing prairie temperatures that first winter, these dwellings were unfortunately damp and uncomfortable.
Up to 66 villages were constructed during the Doukhobors' first year in Canada. Reminiscent of their villages in Russia, they built their homes in the same side-by-side fashion, with a road running through the middle. Each home featured a large clay oven used for baking, cooking, and staying warm, and even offered a warm place for the children and elderly to sleep.
A cornerstone of each village was the communal banya, or bathhouse. Here, a fire would be lit to thoroughly heat large stones. The bathers would pour water over the stones, which would at once fill the room with steam. Stretched out on wooden benches, the bathers would enjoy the steam bath for at least an hour before washing and drying. It was like a little corner of Russia had been transplanted onto the prairies.
The similarities to their homeland, however, stopped there. Many Doukhobor men needed to leave their villages to work on the railroads. Initially, the work was challenging for them, as they were often given wet and swampy areas to work in. Fortunately for the Doukhobors, Sulorzycki was eventually able to advocate for better working conditions. The Doukhobors would stay in tents, shelters made from railroad ties, and even in earthen dugouts, toiling until late autumn when severe frosts prevented further work.
For the general Canadian population, Doukhobor mannerisms were strange, their overall appearance coming across as odd and primitive. Canadians couldn't fathom why the Doukhobors would choose to be vegetarian, and many could not understand their heavy accents. This resulted in frequent misunderstandings and even mistreatment of the Doukhobors. In many cases, the Doukhobors were targets of outright hostility and discrimination. Whether on work sites or in towns, they endured name-calling, mockery, and physical bullying. They would be spat upon, kicked, and shoved. In their first year of settlement, they would frequently be taken advantage of because they didn't speak English, understand the ways of Canadians, or grasp how money was exchanged for goods and services. Although this was challenging for the Doukhobors, they endured this behavior with grace and patience, upholding their principle of peace. Fortunately, with increasing familiarity, relationships between Doukhobors and Canadians became more respectful.
In that first year, many of the villages lacked adequate supplies, food, and nourishment. Doukhobor men, women, and children often suffered exhaustion and a variety of illnesses, such as anemia, scurvy, rashes, sores, eye afflictions, and more. Dr. Velichkina and Nurse Sats, along with other medical assistants, worked tirelessly to treat the ill, prepare medicines, and distribute fish oil. One of the nurses confessed in a letter that she wept when she witnessed malnourishment and illness in the Doukhobor villages. Where there is community, they live in a surprisingly harmonious manner. Young women bring bags of clay up the hill. Old women bring water and mix the clay with their feet, then make bricks. Girls bring sticks from the forest. Boys cut them, and out of all this, men build places to live, she continued. But I do not know whether it will be possible for them to spend a cold winter in these temporary dwellings. The letter concludes, "Is there a hope of receiving medicines? I have almost none now."
Dr. Velichkina wrote far and wide about the dire needs of the Doukhobors. In this way, she received funds towards organizing more medical supplies and support. Additionally, the Quakers provided them with food and resources: sugar, cornmeal, rolled oats, potatoes, onions, dried fruit, tea, linseed oil, wool, and garden seeds. The Quakers also helped increase the Doukhobor livestock with cattle and oxen. Donations of spinning wheels, looms, stoves, tools, cloth, and medicine further helped the Doukhobors immensely.
Overall, the Doukhobors not only survived but made significant progress by the time the next winter set in. With their villages established and their houses built, they were able to cultivate the land and plant their first crops. Although production was small at first, they were able to purchase more supplies. With time, their communal efforts saw them prosper. Their dreams of a peaceful communal utopia were at long last seemingly coming true.
Unfortunately, the dream was short-lived as conflict loomed on the horizon for many Doukhobors. Pressures from the Canadian government to conform to their laws contradicted promises originally made to the Doukhobors. Conflicts arose. Some of what happened to them in Russia seemed to be happening to them now in Canada. Despite the terrible ways Russia had treated the Doukhobors, many became homesick for their motherland and dearly missed the guidance of their beloved leader, Peter Verrigan. In the upcoming modules, we will further address the complexities of Doukhobor life in Canada.